In a world where royalty lives under constant scrutiny, every handshake, every smile, and every sip of tea can become a matter of life and death. What happens when a single moment of alertness from a trained protector stands between a beloved princess and potential disaster? This is the gripping, true account of how one security officer's sharp instincts and split-second decision-making prevented what could have been one of the most shocking incidents in modern royal history. Catherine, Princess of Wales, known to the world as Kate Middleton, had no idea that on what seemed like an ordinary public engagement, she would come within moments of consuming something that could have changed everything. This isn't a story from a thriller novel or a Hollywood screenplay. This is the real account of how vigilance, training, and human intuition combined to protect one of the most watched women in the world from a threat hiding in plain sight. The story you're about to read reveals the hidden dangers that lurk beneath the polished surface of royal duties, where every public appearance is a carefully choreographed dance between accessibility and security. It shows us that behind every royal wave and gracious smile stands an army of dedicated professionals whose job is to think the unthinkable and prepare for the impossible. What makes this story even more remarkable is how it unfolded in full view of cameras and crowds, yet the true drama remained hidden from the public eye until now. It's a testament to the professionalism of the Royal Protection Unit and a stark reminder that in our modern world, even the most seemingly innocent gestures can harbor deadly intentions. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the quaint English countryside as Catherine, Princess of Wales, prepared for what appeared to be another routine royal engagement. The small market town of Henley-on-Thames had been buzzing with excitement for weeks, ever since the announcement that the princess would be visiting their annual charity fair. Local organizers had worked tirelessly to ensure everything would be perfect for the royal visitor. Detective Inspector James Morrison of the Metropolitan Police Royalty and Specialist Protection Command had arrived at the venue 3 hours before the princess was scheduled to appear. At 42 years old, Morrison was a veteran of royal protection, having served the family for over 15 years. His weathered face and sharp gray eyes reflected the vigilance that had kept him and his charges safe through countless public appearances. This morning, however, something felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. The charity fair was being held in the town's historic market square, a picturesque location surrounded by Tudor-style buildings and cobblestone streets. Local vendors had set up colorful stalls, selling everything from homemade preserves to hand-knitted scarves, with all proceeds going to support children's literacy programs across the region. The atmosphere was festive, with bunting strung between lampposts and flowers adorning every corner. Morrison walked the perimeter of the square for the third time that morning, his trained eyes scanning every detail. He mentally cataloged the positions of his team members, the locations of all entry and exit points, and the faces of the growing crowd of well-wishers who had begun to gather despite the early hour. The local police had cordoned off areas for the public and press, creating clear sight lines and controlled access points. As the princess's arrival time approached, Morrison received confirmation through his earpiece that her convoy had left Kensington Palace on schedule. The journey would take approximately 40 minutes, giving him time for final security checks. He coordinated with his team of 6 protection officers, each assigned specific zones and responsibilities. The local police had provided additional support, including armed officers positioned at strategic points around the square. The crowd had grown to several hundred people, a mix of local residents, tourists, and royal enthusiasts who had traveled from nearby towns hoping to catch a glimpse of the princess. Children clutched small Union Jack flags, while others held handmade signs expressing their admiration. Morrison noted with satisfaction that the crowd was enthusiastic but orderly, responding well to the gentle guidance of the police constables managing the barriers. Among the vendors, Morrison paid particular attention to the food and beverage stalls. Protocol required that any consumables offered to members of the royal family undergo strict security screening. The princess was scheduled to visit several stalls, including one run by the local Women's Institute known for their traditional afternoon teas. Morrison had already briefed the organizers about the procedures, emphasizing that nothing should be offered to the princess without prior approval from his team. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a 68-year-old grandmother and longtime member of the Women's Institute, was practically glowing with pride as she arranged delicate china cups and saucers on her stall's pristine white tablecloth. She had been selected to serve tea to the princess, an honor that had kept her awake with excitement for days. Her daughter Sarah had helped her choose the perfect floral dress for the occasion, and her granddaughter Emma had picked fresh flowers from their garden to decorate the stall. The tea service was Mrs. Hartwell's pride and joy, a collection of antique Royal Albert china that had belonged to her grandmother. She had spent hours polishing each piece until it gleamed, and had prepared her finest Earl Grey blend along with an assortment of homemade scones and finger sandwiches. Everything had been arranged with meticulous care, from the hand-embroidered doilies to the silver sugar tongs that had been in her family for generations. Morrison approached Mrs. Hartwell's stall as part of his final inspection. The elderly woman beamed at him, clearly excited about the upcoming visit. "Everything looks wonderful," Morrison told her, though his eyes were methodically scanning every item on the table. "Remember, please wait for my signal before offering anything to Her Royal Highness." "Of course, Inspector," Mrs. Hartwell replied, her voice trembling slightly with nervous excitement. "I've been dreaming of this moment for weeks. My dear grandmother would have been so proud to know that her china would be used to serve tea to a princess."
As Morrison moved on to inspect the neighboring stalls, he noticed a young man who seemed out of place among the vendors and local families. The individual appeared to be in his mid-20s, wearing a plain dark jacket and jeans, and was positioned near the edge of the crowd with a clear view of Mrs. Hartwell's tea stall. While there was nothing obviously suspicious about his appearance, Morrison's instincts had been honed by years of experience, and something about the man's intense focus and nervous energy set off alarm bells. The young man, later identified as Marcus Bennett, was indeed behaving strangely. He kept checking his watch and scanning the crowd, his movements jerky and uncertain. Several witnesses later reported that he seemed agitated, constantly shifting his weight from foot to foot, and running his hands through his hair. What made Morrison particularly uneasy was that Bennett's attention seemed fixated on the tea stall rather than the general area where the princess would be appearing. At precisely 10:30, Morrison received word that the royal convoy was approaching the town. The crowd's excitement reached a fever pitch as people pressed forward against the barriers, hoping for the best possible view. Children were lifted onto parents' shoulders, cameras and mobile phones were raised, and a gentle cheer went up as the familiar sight of the official vehicles came into view. The princess emerged from her car with the grace and confidence that had made her one of the most beloved members of the royal family. Dressed in an elegant blue coat that complemented her sapphire engagement ring, she smiled warmly at the gathered crowd and began the walkabout that would take her past several stalls before culminating at the tea service with Mrs. Hartwell. Morrison positioned himself strategically, maintaining visual contact with the princess while keeping an eye on the crowd's reaction. The public's response was overwhelmingly positive, with people calling out greetings and compliments. The princess stopped frequently to chat with well-wishers, accepting flowers from children and posing for photographs with local officials. As the royal party made its way through the market square, Morrison noticed that Marcus Bennett had moved closer to Mrs. Hartwell's stall. The young man's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and Morrison quietly alerted his colleagues to keep the individual under surveillance. Through his earpiece, he instructed two of his officers to position themselves with clear sight lines to the tea stall while maintaining a discreet distance. The princess's progress through the fair was leisurely and enjoyable, exactly as the organizers had hoped. She admired handmade crafts, sampled local honey, and chatted with vendors about their charitable work. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, with none of the tension that sometimes accompanied large public gatherings. For most observers, it was a perfect example of how the modern monarchy could connect with ordinary citizens in meaningful ways. Hartwell watched nervously as the royal party approached her stall, her hands trembling slightly as she made final adjustments to her display. The princess was just 3 stalls away now, and Mrs. Hartwell could see her engaging warmly with each vendor she encountered. The elderly woman took a deep breath and reminded herself of everything she had practiced, from the proper curtsy to the correct way to pour tea. Morrison's attention was now divided between monitoring the princess's immediate surroundings and keeping track of Marcus Bennett's movements. The young man had positioned himself behind a group of photographers, using their presence as cover while maintaining his view of the tea stall. Morrison's years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct was telling him that something was not right. As the princess moved to the stall immediately adjacent to Mrs. Hartwell's, Morrison made a decision that would prove crucial. He moved closer to the tea stall, positioning himself where he could observe both the princess's interaction with Mrs. Hartwell and Marcus Bennett's behavior. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, ready to call for backup if the situation required it. The moment of truth was approaching. In just a few minutes, the princess would arrive at Mrs. Hartwell's stall for what was supposed to be a charming interlude in a successful public engagement. Neither the excited grandmother nor the gracious princess had any idea that they were about to become part of a drama that would test the limits of royal security and demonstrate the vital importance of professional vigilance in protecting those who serve the public. The princess's arrival at Mrs. Hartwell's tea stall was met with a collective intake of breath from the surrounding crowd. The elderly woman performed a perfect curtsy, her years of practice evident in the graceful movement despite her obvious nerves. "Your Royal Highness, it would be my absolute honor to serve you tea this morning," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Catherine smiled warmly at Mrs. Mardo. Hartwell,
immediately putting the nervous woman at ease with her genuine interest and natural charm. "How lovely. Thank you so much. What a beautiful display you've created." The princess admired the antique china, asking about its history and showing genuine appreciation for the care that had gone into the preparation. Morrison maintained his position nearby, his eyes constantly moving between the princess, Mrs. Hartwell, and the crowd. His earpiece crackled with regular updates from his team, confirming that the perimeter remained secure and the crowd was behaving well. However, his peripheral vision caught Marcus Bennett moving again, this time closer to the stall itself. The young man had managed to position himself near a group of official photographers, blending in with the media contingent that was documenting the princess's visit. Bennett's behavior had become increasingly strange as the morning progressed. Witnesses later described him as sweating profusely despite the cool morning air, frequently checking his mobile phone, and muttering to himself in a way that made those around him uncomfortable. Hartwell began the tea ceremony with practiced precision, warming the pot with hot water before adding her special blend of Earl Grey. The ritual was performed with the kind of attention to detail that had made British tea service famous throughout the world. "This blend has been in our family for generations," she explained to the princess. "My grandmother always said that the secret was in the timing and the quality of the water." The princess showed genuine interest in the process, asking questions about the tea's origins and the tradition of afternoon tea in the local community. This was exactly the kind of authentic cultural exchange that made royal visits meaningful for both the monarchy and the public. The cameras captured every moment, from the careful pouring of the tea to the princess's delighted expression as she prepared to taste Mrs. Hartwell's family blend. Morrison's training had taught him to notice patterns and anomalies, and Marcus Bennett's behavior was definitely anomalous. While everyone else in the crowd was focused on the princess and her interaction with Mrs. Hartwell, Bennett seemed fixated on something specific. Morrison watched as the young man repeatedly glanced at his phone, as if waiting for a message or signal. Through careful observation, Morrison began to piece together Bennett's movements throughout the morning. The young man had arrived early, before most of the general public, and had consistently positioned himself with a clear view of the tea stall. He had shown little interest in any other part of the fair, ignoring the other vendors, and barely acknowledging the princess during her walkabout until she approached Mrs. Hartwell's stall. The detective inspector's years of experience had exposed him to various types of security threats, from overzealous fans to individuals with more sinister intentions. Bennett's behavior exhibited several warning signs that Morrison had learned to recognize. The nervous energy, the fixation on a specific target, the apparent disregard for the overall event in favor of intense focus on one particular moment. As Mrs. Hartwell carefully poured the tea into one of her precious china cups, Morrison made a subtle hand signal to his colleagues. Two of his team members acknowledged the signal and began moving into position, maintaining their cover while preparing to respond if necessary. The movement was so smooth and professional that none of the civilians in the area noticed anything unusual. The princess accepted the delicate teacup with both hands, following proper etiquette while expressing her appreciation for Mrs. Hartwell's hospitality. "This smells absolutely wonderful," she said, bringing the cup closer to inhale the aromatic blend. The crowd watched with rapt attention as their beloved princess prepared to enjoy this simple but meaningful gesture of local hospitality. Morrison's attention was suddenly drawn to Marcus Bennett, who had begun moving with new purpose. The young man was no longer simply observing from a distance but was actively trying to get closer to the tea stall. Morrison watched as Bennett pushed through a group of photographers, claiming he was trying to get a better view of the princess. The detective inspector's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Bennett's movements were too purposeful, too urgent for someone who was simply trying to get a better photograph or view of the royal visitor. Morrison began moving toward the tea stall himself, his hand moving to his radio to alert his team. As the princess raised the teacup toward her lips, Morrison caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Bennett was reaching into his jacket pocket, withdrawing what appeared to be a small vial of clear liquid. The young man's eyes were fixed intently on the princess and the teacup she was about to drink from. In that split second, Morrison's training kicked in. He had spent years learning to assess threats and respond instantaneously to protect his charges. Every fiber of his being was telling him that Marcus Bennett represented a clear and present danger to the princess's safety. The detective inspector made the decision that would define the rest of his career. "Ma'am, please don't drink that," Morrison called out, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur with unmistakable authority. The princess looked up in surprise, the teacup still poised near her lips. The entire crowd seemed to freeze as Morrison moved swiftly toward the tea stall. Mrs. Hartwell's face went pale as she realized something was wrong. Her hands began to shake as she watched Morrison approach, clearly confused about what could be happening. The carefully orchestrated atmosphere of the royal visit suddenly shifted from celebration to tension as Morrison's colleagues responded to his alert. Bennett's reaction to Morrison's intervention was immediate and telling. Instead of looking confused or concerned like everyone else in the crowd, the young man's face showed panic and frustration.
He quickly tried to conceal the vial he had been holding, but Morrison had already seen it and was moving to intercept him. The princess, trained in protocol and security procedures, immediately understood that Morrison's warning should be taken seriously.
She carefully set down the teacup without drinking from it, her expression remaining calm despite the obvious tension in the situation. Her years of royal training had prepared her to trust her protection officers completely, even when their instructions seemed to come from nowhere. Morrison reached Bennett just as the young man was attempting to disappear back into the crowd.
"Sir, I need you to stop right there," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. Bennett's attempt to flee only confirmed Morrison's suspicions that something sinister was unfolding.
The crowd began to realize that something unusual was happening, though most people couldn't understand exactly what was going on. Children pointed and asked their parents questions while adults strained to see what had captured the attention of the security officers. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to confusion as more members of Morrison's team moved into action. Mrs. O asked. Hartwell stood frozen beside her tea stall, watching in horror as her perfect morning transformed into something she couldn't comprehend. The teacup that had been prepared with such love and care sat abandoned on the table, its contents now viewed with suspicion rather than anticipation.
Her dreams of serving tea to a princess had become a nightmare in the space of just a few seconds. Bennett was now clearly attempting to flee, pushing roughly through the crowd as Morrison and his colleagues pursued him. The young man's panic was evident to everyone around him, and his desperate attempts to escape only served to confirm that Morrison's instincts had been correct. Something had been terribly wrong with the situation at the tea stall.
The princess remained calm and composed despite the chaos erupting around her. Her protection training had taught her to follow the instructions of her security team without question, and she moved away from the tea stall as directed by Morrison's colleagues. Her primary concern seemed to be for Mrs. Hartwell, who was clearly distressed by the sudden turn of events.
As Bennett continued his desperate flight through the crowd, Morrison radioed for additional backup, and for the immediate seizure and analysis of everything on Mrs. Hartwell's tea stall. The detective inspector's quick thinking and decisive action had prevented what could have been a catastrophic incident, but the full scope of the threat was only beginning to become clear. The pursuit of Marcus Bennett through the crowded market square created chaos that transformed the peaceful royal visit into a scene of urgent drama. Morrison's colleagues, responding to his radio calls with practiced efficiency, began converging on Bennett's position while maintaining crowd control to prevent panic among the hundreds of civilians present. Bennett's flight was hampered by the density of the crowd and his obvious lack of familiarity with the layout of the market square.
He stumbled through groups of families, knocked over a child's pushchair, and sent a display of handmade crafts crashing to the ground in his desperate attempt to escape. His panic was evident to everyone around him, and his erratic behavior began to alarm the civilians who found themselves in his path. Detective Sergeant Sarah Collins, a member of Morrison's team positioned at the square's eastern exit, received the alert and moved to intercept Bennett. At 35 years old, Collins was a veteran police officer with extensive training in both crowd control and suspect apprehension. She had been watching the crowd from her assigned position when Morrison's urgent radio call came through. Collins could see Bennett pushing through the crowd toward her position, his face flushed with exertion and fear. She noted his approximate height and build, the dark jacket Morrison had described, and most importantly, the small glass vial he was still clutching in his right hand despite his attempts to conceal it. The detective sergeant positioned herself near a narrow alleyway that led away from the market square, calculating that Bennett would likely try to escape through one of the less crowded exits. Her training had taught her to anticipate suspect behavior, and fleeing individuals typically sought the path of least resistance. Meanwhile, back at the tea stall, Morrison's remaining team members were securing the scene and ensuring the princess's safety. The Royal Protection Protocol called for immediate isolation and analysis of any potential threats, which meant that everything on Mrs. Hartwell's carefully prepared table would need to be examined by forensic specialists. Mrs. Hartwell watched in bewilderment as police officers carefully photographed her tea service before sealing the teacup and its contents in evidence bags. Her daughter Sarah had arrived after receiving an urgent phone call from a neighbor who had seen the commotion on television and was now trying to comfort her devastated mother.
"I don't understand what's happening, Mrs.
Hartwell kept repeating, her voice shaking with distress.
Everything was perfect. I've been preparing for weeks. How could something be wrong with my tea? The elderly woman's confusion was heartbreaking to witness as she struggled to comprehend how her moment of honor had become part of a potential crime scene. The princess, displaying the composure and grace that had made her a beloved public figure, took time to speak personally with Mrs. Hartwell, despite the ongoing security situation.
Please don't worry, she told the distraught woman. You've done nothing wrong. The officers are just being cautious, which is exactly what they should do. Your kindness and preparation are obvious to everyone here. Bennett's escape attempt was becoming increasingly desperate as he realized that police officers seemed to be appearing from multiple directions.
The coordination of Morrison's team was evident as they communicated through their radio network, sharing Bennett's location and predicted movements while maintaining their professional demeanor to avoid alarming the public unnecessarily. The young man's path through the market square was being systematically cut off as officers moved to secure potential exit points.
Bennett could see uniformed police officers at the main entrances to the square, and plainclothes protection officers seemed to be closing in from other directions. His panic increased as he realized he was being effectively surrounded.
Detective Sergeant Collins made her move as Bennett approached the alleyway she had been watching. "Police officer, stop where you are," she commanded, stepping into Bennett's path with her warrant card clearly visible. Her tone was authoritative but not aggressive, following the protocols for suspect apprehension in a crowded public space. Bennett's reaction was immediate and telling.
Instead of stopping or showing confusion at being confronted by police, he immediately changed direction and began running toward a different part of the square. His behavior left no doubt that he was aware of having committed some wrongdoing and was attempting to evade capture.
The chase continued through the market square, with Bennett weaving between stalls and jumping over low barriers in his increasingly frantic attempt to escape. His movements were being tracked by multiple officers and his route was being communicated to colleagues positioned around the perimeter of the area.
Morrison, who had remained near the tea stall to coordinate the evidence collection and ensure the princess's continued safety, was receiving regular updates on Bennett's location through his earpiece.
The detective inspector's primary concern was still the potential threat to the princess, but he was also beginning to piece together the implications of what they had discovered. The small vial that Bennett had been carrying was clearly significant, given his desperate attempts to conceal it and his immediate flight when challenged. Morrison's experience told him that individuals carrying unknown substances near members of the royal family represented an extremely serious security threat that required immediate investigation. Collins finally cornered Bennett near the square's southern exit, where he had become trapped between a police barrier and a group of confused tourists who were trying to understand why their peaceful morning had suddenly become so chaotic. The detective sergeant approached carefully, but training emphasizing the importance of secure apprehension while minimizing risk to bystanders. "Sir, you need to stop and place your hands where I can see them," Collins instructed, her voice carrying the authority of her position while maintaining a professional tone. Bennett's response was to make one final desperate attempt to escape, but he stumbled and fell as he tried to climb over a temporary fence, landing heavily on the cobblestones. The fall resulted in the vial Bennett had been carrying being thrown from his grasp, where it shattered against the stone pavement. The clear liquid it contained spread across the ground, creating a small puddle that Collins immediately recognized as potentially dangerous evidence. She called for the area to be secured and for specialist equipment to analyze the spilled substance. Bennett's capture was swift and professional once he was on the ground. Collins and her colleague, Constable Matthews, secured the suspect with minimal force while ensuring that any remaining evidence was preserved. Bennett's behavior during the arrest continued to suggest guilt and awareness of wrongdoing, as he remained largely silent except for repeated denials of having done anything wrong. The analysis of the spilled liquid would later reveal the true scope of the threat that Morrison's quick thinking had prevented. Initial field tests suggested the presence of several toxic compounds that would have been extremely dangerous if consumed, particularly by someone of the princess's relatively small stature. Back at the tea stall, forensic specialists were conducting preliminary tests on the contents of the teacup that the princess had been about to drink. The tests were being conducted with extreme care, as the potential implications of any positive results would be enormous for both the investigation and royal security procedures. Morrison coordinated with senior officers who had arrived to take command of what was now being treated as a serious criminal investigation. The detective inspector's actions in preventing the princess from drinking the tea were being praised by his superiors, but Morrison remained focused on ensuring that all potential evidence was properly secured and analyzed. The princess was escorted away from the market square by her protection team, her public engagement ending abruptly but safely thanks to Morrison's vigilance. Her departure was conducted with minimal disruption to the ongoing investigation, though the crowd of well-wishers was clearly disappointed by the sudden conclusion to what had begun as such a successful visit. Mrs. Hartwell was interviewed by detectives as a potential witness rather than a suspect,
as initial investigation suggested that she had been an unwitting participant in what appeared to be a planned attack on the princess. The elderly woman's obvious distress and genuine confusion about the events made it clear that she had no knowledge of any threat to royal safety.
The investigation was just beginning, but the preliminary evidence suggested that Morrison's instincts had been correct and that his quick action had prevented what could have been a tragic incident. The full scope of the plot and Bennett's motivations would only become clear through detailed investigation, but the immediate threat to the princess had been successfully neutralized.
The immediate aftermath of Marcus Bennett's arrest transformed the quaint market square into a complex crime scene requiring the coordinated efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies. Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Thornfield from Scotland Yard's Counter-Terrorism Command had been called in to oversee what was rapidly developing into one of the most serious threats against the royal family in recent years. Thornfield, a highly experienced investigator with over 20 years of service, arrived at the scene within an hour of Bennett's capture. Her reputation for methodical investigation and her expertise in cases involving threats to national security made her the natural choice to lead this sensitive inquiry.
She immediately established a command post in the town hall, away from the public eye and media attention that was beginning to descend on Henley-on-Thames. The forensic analysis of the spilled liquid from Bennett's vial was being conducted at a specialized laboratory, but preliminary field tests had already revealed the presence of several concerning substances.
Dr. Amanda Foster, a toxicologist with the Metropolitan Police's Forensic Science Unit, was leading the analysis and had provided initial findings that confirmed Morrison's worst fears. The substance contains a cocktail of highly toxic compounds, Dr. Foster reported to Thornfield during a secure video conference. We've identified traces of ricin, along with several other plant-based toxins that would have been lethal if consumed in the quantity that was present in the vial. Even a small amount mixed with liquid would have been enough to cause severe poisoning or death.
The revelation that Bennett had been carrying a potentially lethal substance sent shockwaves through the investigation team. What had begun as Morrison's intuitive response to suspicious behavior had evolved into the prevention of what could have been an assassination attempt on one of the most beloved members of the British royal family. Bennett himself was being held at a high-security facility while investigators attempted to piece together his background and motivations. During his initial interviews, he had remained largely silent, responding to questions only through his solicitor, and providing no explanation for his presence at the royal engagement or his possession of the toxic substances.
The investigation into Bennett's background revealed a troubled young man with a history of mental health issues and increasingly extreme political views. Detective Sergeant Michael Harrison, assigned to research Bennett's background, discovered a disturbing online presence filled with anti-monarchy sentiment and conspiracy theories about the royal family.
Bennett had been active on several extremist forums where he expressed violent fantasies about harming members of the royal family, Harrison reported to Thornfield. His posts show an escalating pattern of threats and detailed discussions about various methods of assassination.
He seems to have become particularly fixated on Princess Catherine over the past 6 months. The online trail revealed that Bennett had spent considerable time researching the princess's public schedule and had identified the charity fair as an opportunity to get close to her.
His plan appeared to have been months in the making, with evidence of careful preparation and reconnaissance of the venue in the weeks leading up to the event. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed instructions Bennett had received from other extremist contacts about the preparation and use of the toxic compounds found in his vial.
The investigation revealed a network of individuals who had been encouraging and advising Bennett on his planned attack, turning what might have been the isolated act of a disturbed individual into something more coordinated and sinister. Mrs. Chambers, Mrs. Cott.
Hartwell's role in the plot was quickly determined to be entirely innocent, but the investigation revealed how Bennett had planned to contaminate her tea service. Surveillance footage from the days leading up to the royal visit showed Bennett conducting reconnaissance of the market square, carefully observing the setup and identifying Mrs. Hartwell's stall as his target. Bennett had been watching the preparations for several days, explained Detective Constable Emma Rodriguez, who had been reviewing security footage from businesses around the market square. He knew exactly when Mrs. Hartwell would arrive to set up her stall, and he had identified several opportunities to access her tea supplies without being detected. The plan had been sophisticated in its simplicity. Bennett had intended to contaminate Mrs. Hartwell's tea service during the early morning setup, when security was lighter and attention was focused on other preparations. He had carefully chosen a time when he could approach the stall without attracting notice, add the toxic substances to the tea or the serving vessels, and then blend back into the crowd to watch the results.
The investigation revealed that Bennett had made several practice runs in the days before the royal visit, timing his approach to the tea stall and identifying the best escape routes from the market square. His detailed planning suggested a level of premeditation that made the crime far more serious than a spontaneous act of violence.
Morrison's intervention had disrupted Bennett's plan at the crucial moment, forcing the would-be assassin to attempt his contamination in full view of security officers rather than during the quieter setup period he had originally planned. The detective inspector's vigilance had not only prevented the princess from consuming the poisoned tea, but it also led to Bennett's capture with evidence that would ensure a successful prosecution. The broader investigation began to reveal connections between Bennett and other individuals who posed potential threats to the royal family. Counter-terrorism officers conducted raids on several properties associated with Bennett's online contacts, uncovering additional evidence of plots against various public figures and members of the monarchy.
This appears to have been part of a broader pattern of extremist activity, Chief Inspector Thornfield explained during a briefing with senior officials. Bennett was not acting alone, and his contacts had been encouraging similar attacks by other individuals.
We've identified at least 3 other people who may have been planning similar actions. The security implications of the plot led to an immediate review of protection procedures for all members of the royal family.
The ease with which Bennett had been able to get close to the princess despite the presence of professional protection officers highlighted potential vulnerabilities in current security arrangements. Dr.
Foster's continued analysis of the toxic substances revealed that Bennett had access to materials that suggested significant expertise in chemistry or connections to individuals with such knowledge. The compounds we found were not the kind of thing an amateur could produce, she explained. Someone with considerable knowledge of toxicology had provided either the materials or the instructions for their preparation. The investigation into the source of the toxic materials led detectives into the dark corners of the internet where extremist groups shared information about weapons and assassination techniques. Bennett's communications revealed that he had been in contact with individuals across several countries who had provided encouragement and technical assistance for his planned attack.
Mrs. Hartwell, meanwhile, was struggling to come to terms with how her innocent tea service had been targeted for such a sinister purpose.
The elderly woman had been devastated to learn that her moment of pride had been chosen by someone who intended to use her hospitality as a weapon against the princess she had been so honored to serve. I keep thinking about what could have happened. Mrs. Hogg. Tease. Hartwell told investigators during one of her witness interviews. That lovely young woman could have been hurt or killed, and I would have been the one who served her the tea.
How do you live with something like that, even if you didn't know what was happening? The psychological impact on Mrs. Hartwell and her family became an additional consideration for the investigation team.
Victim support services were provided to help them cope with the trauma of having been unknowingly involved in what could have been a royal assassination, and security measures were put in place to protect them from potential retaliation by extremist supporters.
As the investigation continued, the full scope of Bennett's plot and the network that had supported him began to emerge. What Morrison had prevented through his quick thinking and professional vigilance was not just an isolated attack, but potentially the first in a series of planned assaults on the royal family and other public figures. The detective inspector's actions had disrupted not just one crime but an entire conspiracy that could have had far-reaching consequences for British society and the institution of the monarchy. 6 months after the dramatic events at Henley-on-Thames, Marcus Bennett stood in the dock at the Old Bailey facing charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life behind bars.
The trial had captured international attention, not only because of the target of Bennett's plot but because of the broader implications it revealed about domestic terrorism and threats to democratic institutions. The prosecution, led by Sir James Blackwood QC, presented a case that detailed every aspect of Bennett's planned assassination attempt.
The evidence was overwhelming. From the forensic analysis of the toxic substances to the digital trail that revealed months of planning and coordination with extremist contacts across multiple countries. The defendant had planned and prepared for months to murder Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales. Sir James told the jury during his opening statement. Only the exceptional vigilance and quick thinking of Detective Inspector Morrison prevented what would have been one of the most shocking crimes in British history. The trial proceedings revealed the full extent of Bennett's extremist beliefs and his gradual descent into violent radicalization. Expert witnesses testified about the process by which individuals become radicalized online and how extremist communities provide both encouragement and technical assistance for terrorist attacks. Dr. Sarah Matthews, a leading expert on domestic terrorism, explained to the court how Bennett's case represented a growing trend of lone wolf attacks inspired by online extremist communities. The defendant represents a new type of terrorist threat, she testified. While he acted alone on the day of the planned attack, he was supported and encouraged by a network of individuals who shared his extremist ideology.
The defense team, led by Margaret Sinclair, QC, attempted to argue that Bennett's mental health issues diminished his responsibility for the planned attack. They presented evidence of his history of depression and anxiety, suggesting that he had been manipulated by more sophisticated extremist actors who had exploited his vulnerabilities. However, the prosecution's case demonstrated that Bennett's planning had been methodical and sustained over many months, showing a level of premeditation that undermined any claims of diminished responsibility.
The detailed reconnaissance he had conducted, the careful timing of his planned attack, and his sophisticated escape plan all pointed to someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Morrison testified as the key prosecution witness, describing his observations of Bennett's suspicious behavior and his decision to prevent the princess from drinking the contaminated tea.
The detective inspector's calm and professional demeanor in the witness box impressed the jury, and his explanation of his thought process that morning provided crucial insight into how the plot had been foiled. I had been watching the defendant for some time because his behavior was inconsistent with that of a normal well-wisher, Morrison explained to the court.
His fixation on the tea stall, his nervous demeanor, and his apparent disinterest in actually seeing the princess all suggested that he had ulterior motives for being there. The cross-examination by the defense attempted to suggest that Morrison had overreacted to innocent behavior, but the detective inspector's extensive experience and the subsequent discovery of the toxic substances made such arguments untenable. Morrison's actions were clearly vindicated by the evidence that emerged after Bennett's arrest. Mrs. Hartwell also testified, describing her innocent preparations for the royal visit and her devastation upon learning how her tea service had been targeted. Her testimony was particularly moving as she described the honor she had felt at being chosen to serve the princess and her horror at discovering how that moment had been selected for such a sinister purpose. "I had been so proud, so excited to serve tea to the princess," Mrs. Hartwell told the court, her voice breaking with emotion. "To learn that someone wanted to use my tea, my grandmother's china, to hurt her was absolutely heartbreaking. I still have nightmares about what could have happened." The investigation had also uncovered Bennett's broader connections to extremist networks, leading to additional arrests and charges against several of his online contacts. The trial revealed how these networks operate, sharing tactical knowledge and providing psychological support for individuals planning attacks against public figures. Detective Chief Inspector Thornfield testified about the broader investigation that had followed Bennett's arrest, describing how the case had exposed a significant network of individuals plotting attacks against various targets. "The defendant's case was not an isolated incident," she explained to the court. "He was part of a broader extremist movement that poses an ongoing threat to public safety and democratic institutions." The forensic evidence presented during the trial left no doubt about the lethality of Bennett's planned attack. Dr. Foster testified about the toxic substances found in Bennett's possession, explaining that even a small amount would have been sufficient to cause severe poisoning or death. The quantity Bennett had prepared suggested he had intended to ensure the princess's death rather than merely causing illness. "The concentration of toxins we found would have been lethal within hours if consumed," Dr. Foster told the court. The defendant had clearly researched the most effective methods of poisoning, and the substances he had prepared were more than sufficient to achieve his intended result. The trial also examined the security implications of Bennett's plot and the measures that had been put in place to prevent similar attacks in the future. The head of Royal Protection testified about the ongoing challenges of balancing public accessibility with security requirements, and how Bennett's case had led to significant changes in protection protocols. After a trial lasting 3 weeks, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a unanimous guilty verdict on all charges, including attempted murder, possession of toxic substances with intent to endanger life, and conspiracy to commit terrorism. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Bennett. Judge Sir William Pemberton sentenced Bennett to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years, describing the case as one of the most serious terrorist offenses ever brought before a British court. In his sentencing remarks, the judge praised Morrison's actions and emphasized the broader implications of the case for public safety. Detective Inspector Morrison's vigilance and quick thinking prevented what could have been a national tragedy, Judge Pemberton said. His actions exemplify the highest standards of professional policing and demonstrate the vital importance of skilled protection officers in safeguarding our democratic institutions. The princess herself issued a statement through Kensington Palace following the conclusion of the trial, expressing her gratitude to Morrison and his team while also acknowledging the impact on Mrs. Hartwell and the local community. "I am deeply grateful to Detective Inspector Morrison and all the officers who ensured my safety that day," the statement read. "My thoughts remain with Mrs. Hartwell, who showed such kindness and hospitality despite being unknowingly caught up in these terrible events." Morrison was subsequently awarded the George Medal for his actions, recognizing his exceptional bravery and professional skill in preventing the assassination attempt. The detective inspector, typically modest about his role, emphasized that his actions were simply the result of proper training and the support of his professional colleagues.
"I was just doing my job," Morrison said during the medal ceremony at Buckingham Palace.
The real heroes are the forensic specialists, investigators, and prosecutors who built the case that ensured Bennett could never threaten anyone again. I'm proud to be part of a team that takes the protection of our democratic institutions seriously. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond the individual conviction. The investigation had exposed significant vulnerabilities in how extremist networks operate online and had led to enhanced cooperation between law enforcement agencies in monitoring and disrupting such networks. Mrs. Hartwell eventually returned to her community work with the Women's Institute, though she never again volunteered to serve tea at public events. The elderly woman had been deeply affected by her unwitting involvement in the plot, but had found some measure of peace in knowing that her cooperation with the investigation had helped ensure Bennett's conviction.
"I'm still proud of my tea service and my grandmother's china, Mrs. Adams,"
Hartwell said in an interview months after the trial, "but I'll never forget how close we came to something terrible happening. Detective Inspector Morrison saved not just the princess but also me from being part of something horrible." The case became a landmark in British terrorism law and led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies monitor and respond to online extremist activity. Bennett's conviction served as both justice for his attempted crime and a deterrent to others who might consider similar attacks. The events at Henley-on-Thames ultimately demonstrated both the ongoing threats faced by public figures in democratic societies and the effectiveness of professional protection when combined with proper training, vigilance, and quick thinking. Morrison's actions that morning had prevented not just a single crime but had disrupted a network of extremist activity that could have led to many more attacks. In the years that followed, the case would be studied by law enforcement agencies around the world as an example of how domestic terrorism threats could be identified and neutralized through professional vigilance and effective investigation. The princess continued her public duties, protected by officers who had learned valuable lessons from the events of that morning in the market square. The story of Detective Inspector Morrison's intervention would become part of the official history of royal protection, a reminder that the safety of democratic institutions depends not just on grand security measures, but on the daily vigilance and professionalism of the dedicated individuals who stand guard against those who would use violence to achieve their political goals. One suspicious sip. Guard steps in and saves Princess Kate.